Today, I'm going to be looking over the Harvestella Prologue Demo from a technical, gameplay, and presentation side of things to help you decide whether or not you should get the full game. If you remember back to last week, there was a Nintendo Direct which spawned many memes about farming sim games because there were quite a few. One of these was Harvestella, which will be releasing on Steam and Switch on November 4th, 2022. They also released a demo which covered the first 2 chapters of the story, or the first 15 days. I will be talking about these later in the video. I'll also be showing clips of the gameplay throughout, so some of these might have story implications, but I'll try my best to not have these be obvious. Now, if you don't know what Harvestella is, it is a life sim RPG being developed and published by Square Enix. Players will be able to grow and tend crops, cook and craft items, visit different towns, interact with townsfolk, go fishing, and much more. On top of that, combat is a staple of this game, with dungeoneering being required to gather some materials and to advance the RPG story that I'll talk about a little bit later. Also, I'd like to know a bit from you guys. Have you played the demo? And if so, what are your thoughts? Okay, now on to my review stuff. From a technical perspective, there were some issues. I should be clear, I played the entire demo docked on my Switch, so I only saw the best of what it could perform. I cannot talk about the frame rate or resolution of the undocked play experience or the Switch's battery life. In a docked session though, there were already times where some of these were lacking. Some animations had a decent slowdown, while the world at time would appear to be fuzzy due to the resolution being generally pretty low. Typically, I'm not one to care about these, but they were jarringly noticeable during the demo, so I thought I should mention them right away. If these are issues for you, consider getting the Steam version if you're able to and want to get the full game. Also, if there are issues while the game is docked, I would expect it to be similar or worse while playing the game undocked. Okay, on to gameplay. The first area that I want to talk about is farming, because on this channel I primarily deal with farming and life sim games. During the demo, I was able to play in spring, so I guess I'll focus on that. Right away, I was given a fairly small farming plot with a few seeds to plant, and this mostly works the same way as it does in any other farming sim. Plow, plant, water, harvest, repeat. There are some areas that annoyed me, like I couldn't repeatedly use a tool by holding down the button, unless it was the watering can, but that stands out on its own. There are seasonal crops, repeatedly harvestable crops, and trees that can grow in any season but are only harvestable in one. And finally, crops that can be grown in multiple seasons. While I wasn't able to test them due to me being too slow at getting money, there were pens for animals of sorts, so it looks like ranching will also be a feature. My final thoughts are that it's pretty standard farming. If you like doing it in Story of Seasons, Rune Factory, or Stardew Valley, you'll like it here. Next, let's look at the other side of this tree, combat and dungeons. When playing the game, you'll be given several jobs that you can play, but these will unlock over time, with the first being Fighter. Each job will have its own skill tree and fighting style. For example, the Fighter is a close-range character and can use elemental magic to use fire strikes on people. The second class that I played was Mage, which has a basic attack that is ranged area freezing magic, but I also had a skill to use electrical damage. These jobs were somewhat freely interchangeable, as I can select up to 3 to use and can press some buttons to change between them in combat. There were decently long cooldowns for everything, so no spam switching or ability usage, but it didn't feel that bad. That said, the combat basically boils down to one button attacking and using abilities, so nothing too complex. I do generally prefer more complex combat in games that I play, but it gets the job done for what it is. You also have a party of up to 3 characters. However, from what I saw of these companion characters, they aren't extremely useful in combat. On to the dungeons. During the demo, we were able to play through one of these. Overall, they appear to be quite large, have ever-increasingly difficult enemies, and have a natural flow to them. You're rewarded with small chests for going off the beaten path, and many of these have materials you need to upgrade tools, or more seeds for you to grow on your farm. This means that exploring is beneficial to both the life sim and combat sides of the game, which is just naturally good. I did say that the dungeons are large. They'll take multiple days to clear, and as you go through them, you can spend time to open up shortcuts, you can unlock quick travel points, and you can find some rest points. While you explore, you will find some large creatures of a much higher level than you called fears, which need to be avoided to progress. This helps break up the autonomy of simply slashing your way through the game. Finally, the first dungeon had 2 different bosses in it, which gave a decent challenge and sense of progression for a literal starting dungeon. And that's really all we know about them. So next I want to talk about some of the smaller areas of the game. I don't want to spend too much time on any of them individually, but I feel like they're important enough to talk about for all of you. First, the animations in the game are a little wonky. Running in particular shows this off quite well. It just feels like there wasn't enough time put into them to make some of them fit the characters. Speaking of characters, during my stream of the preview, the character models became somewhat of a meme themselves, as the proportions are a little odd. This may be a big deal to some, but there is very little voice acting in the game, and none of the main story is voiced. This may seem weird or behind the times to many, but honestly, it's pretty much the norm in farming sim games. It doesn't really bother me, but for some, it could be an issue, so I included it. And before anyone says, "Oh, but My Time at Portia has it," yeah, they had it. But they also didn't pay voice actors for the work until the news blew up that they were essentially stealing it from them. I think I prefer no voices to that. The next point is character creation, where we have fairly few choices. We can choose from 2 different bodies, 1 masculine, 1 feminine, 4 skin colors, and we can choose from 3 gender options, male, female, and non-binary. Oh, and we get to pick an eye color. I almost forgot about that one too. Overall, it's pretty underwhelming, with the most exciting choice being the gender. That said, in actual dialogue and story, it made about as much of an impact as you would expect. Basically, after choosing it, I didn't even notice that it was a choice until midway through the prologue when a kid referred to me as them when talking to another NPC. What do you know? It's not a big deal, and the only thing it does is switch around maybe 1 or 2 words every 30 minutes of gameplay. How terrible. When talking about characters, I should mention a few things about other characters. This whole demo took place in a prologue, so there's not a ton of other main NPCs to really talk about. Without spoiling anything though, I honestly thought that the ones that were there were pretty well designed. They didn't feel samey, they all had their own ways of talking and viewpoints, and most importantly, they were overall pretty interesting. The 2D art using conversations was really well done, and overall they may be one of the driving forces of this game, along with the story. That said, at times the dialogue and character decision making is completely weird. Without spoiling stuff, that's all I want to say about it. The last thing before I get to the story is a few of the other small things. First, I could not fish during the prologue, so I can't speak on that. Second, harvesting resources in the wild is essentially going to a harvest point daily and clicking a button. Not super exciting. Third, the crafting and upgrading of stuff in the house or weapons are done at shops in towns and ask for resources and a good chunk of change. Fourth, within your house there's a specific area, the loft, that appears to be the area that you decorate. The rest of the house is non-decoratable. Fifth, travel through the world is fairly time consuming, so you may need to plan days out if you want to do many things in them. And lastly, stamina is present for everything. If you want to run around, plant, and fight a ton in a day, you'll need a decent amount of food. Okay, the final and main area to look at in this game, the story. Originally, I wanted to give a big summary and run through everything, but I don't really think it's needed. Basically, the story is the main focus of the game and the driving force behind everything. It also, at least to me, was intriguing enough to bring me back to the prologue after I stopped halfway through. While it might not be the most original at times, it is well done, and it's clear that it is what comes first. Honestly, out of the few life sim RPGs that I've been trying recently, this one clearly has the system down and has built upon it. The story and role-playing come first, the life sim second. That isn't to say that the life sim is worse, but the developers knew what they wanted to prioritize coming into the game, and it does make the game better for it. So, with all that said, what is my final conclusion? If you aren't interested in the overall story, combat, or world building, don't get this game. It is clear to me that the life sim is not the main focus, but it's still done up to the arguably low standards of the genre, and it doesn't really push these standards forward, at least in the prologue, and I would expect more of that in the full game. Now, if you do like combat and story, but the technical issues bother you, either play it on Steam or skip the game. Sadly, I do not foresee the issues getting much better before November. With all that said, this prologue did cement the decision in my head to both buy and play this game when it comes out. If you are still in the air about it, I do recommend trying it for yourself if you have a Switch to download the demo, and saves will carry over to the full game. But sadly, there's currently not a way to try the game on Steam. This was my first attempt at reviewing a game, or prologue, I guess. So if you guys have any feedback at all, please let me know in the comments below, and thank you for watching.